Start recording now. And this week's portion, of course, is Devarim. We've started a new book of the Torah. It's also called the Mishneh Torah, which means kind of like the retelling, the condensation, the recounting of the history and the commandments and some of the narrative that's occurred beforehand. So it's a little condensed book. But I think it was in the last Torah portion of the Torah before last where we pointed out how many curses are actually in the book of Deuteronomy, which is sobering. So in the same book that we get the Song of Moses, we also get a bunch of curses if we don't live according to the commandments. And so it's joy on the one hand, and then there's a balance of sobriety on the other. And that's really the theme I want to bring forth in this week's Torah portion. So let me share the screen with you. And it's going to be about the balance sheet. And everybody knows what a balance sheet is. When you're in accounting, when you have a business or whatever, even if you just keep your own checkbook, you have to have a ledger. You have to have some type of a balance sheet that tells you whether you're overdrawn or not, whether you've had at least as many deposits as you've had withdrawals. So it makes sure that you're healthy. You're in a good balance. And in this week's Torah portion, we're going to see that a place called Cheshbon was mentioned as this stronghold of Sichon and Og. They're living in approximately the same area geographically. If you pull up your Near East maps, you can see how overlapping their territory often was. And so Cheshbon means accounting. It's like, come check the ledger. Let's sit down and count the money, and let's see if we can live or not. If this is actually able of taking us forward. And I brought out some facts last night to the Monday night class about, well, there were several fast facts, but one of the facts was numbers, and I'll show them to you, how much of the Torah and the Bible and even Jewish rabbinic literature depends upon there being the land of Israel itself, not just the spiritual land of Israel, which we do talk about a lot, but there also being a physical, literal, natural land of Israel that is the focal point that somehow brings you closer to the spiritual aspect of Israel and what we would say is the lower garden, to that restoration that Yeshua came to do. And so I stumbled onto this map on Unsplash. I wasn't really even looking for a map. And this popped up when I typed in, I think I typed in ledger or balance sheet, one of those accounting words like that, because I thought that would make the best visual for the Torah portion based on where I was going with Cheshbon. And this picture popped up, and I thought, what in the world is that? And then I looked at it, and I realized it was an exact representation of something that's bothered me for years. And it's not necessarily, it doesn't bother me so much with the people that I know are truly committed to the walk. It's people I've known who I thought were committed to this walk, and yet in some way they've fallen away. Maybe they've gone back to church. Maybe their point of focus is now, completely somewhere else. Where do they spend the majority of their time when they do their balance sheet at the end of the day? It's probably with family. It's probably at work. And in terms of physical time, we all may have that kind of a balance sheet because we probably spend more waking hours at work than we do with our own families. But what happens is frequently we become so engrossed in family, friends, hobbies, work, just the everyday duties of life. So far this morning, we've had the drama of the FedEx man, we've had the drama of the trash man, we've had the drama of the propane man, and we've had the drama of the air conditioner repairman. And then all the people texting me to make sure I'm in the right place at the right time, to make sure all these dramas play out properly in my life. And so before you know it, a morning is gone. A morning of Bible study, a morning of meditation, a morning of prayer. And that's the way life works. We can't move all of those things out of our lives unless we do move out to a desert. And that's an open possibility right now. We have to deal with those things. But again, I think I said this last year, if you're making a statement like, I need to make time for Torah study, then you're already wrong. Because your Torah study, your time of worship, prayer, meditation, the rest of your week should be arranged around that. You should know when you're going to study God's word each day. You should know when you're going to pray each day. That shouldn't really be open to, well, let me, figure out how I'm going to do it. It's no, you're going to do those things, and you know the times that you were able to do them, and everything else has to work around it. And one of the things that brought to mind was when I was a kid, when I was growing up, I knew a few pastors. In fact, one pastor and his wife were actually my legal guardians for a period of time, and I lived with them. One thing all these pastors had in common, and this would have been in the 60s and the 70s, is they each had a study. And sometimes it was a set-aside room in a house, or sometimes it was an office at the church. Sometimes it was maybe a little, like a room near the parsonage. But there were certain hours of the day that the preacher would go into his study. And he would study and he would pray. And the time that he spent in there really didn't even include the time he spent doing administrative things. Those were extra things. And pretty much the door was open at those times. If he was doing more business-like work, or if he went to the hospital or so forth to visit the sick. If he went to the print shop to print the bulletins, whatever he had to do, that was extra. But there was a inviolable time of day when he would retreat into that study for those necessary things, which is to make sure he was checking his own balance sheet before he tried to do anything else the rest of the day. And I know just from being in those homes, those pastors tended to do that early in the day. It wasn't something they waited till 3 or 4 in the afternoon, although they could, but that was set aside early in the day. And it was back then a matter of priority. And now, and people knew better than to knock on the door unless it was life and death. If it was life and death, you could knock on the door. Other than that, you don't disturb him during that time. We don't set those boundaries anymore. And part of it is iPhones and laptops and delivery men and so forth. They've been able to encroach upon that to a large extent so that we're always available. And a lot of times just we can't resist the temptation, like when I hear a ding, to look and see who it is. Because 99% of the time it's nothing, but 1% of the time, right now, my mother-in-law is in the hospital in Texas, so I'm going to make sure, I'm kind of monitoring that. And it seems like we have a situation going on like that all the time, that before, in the 60s, that wasn't going to happen. If there was a bad phone call, then somebody would come and knock on the door. But other than that, you wouldn't be disturbed with 98 other things that aren't that important. They're not more important than your quiet time with Adonai. So to me, this map represented how our priorities have become completely misplaced. Because the lady that put this picture up said this was like one of their travel map. And I guess they collected money when they went traveling. But look at all the pins where they have made priority time to travel and visit. And I looked and I'm like, is that a penny on top of Israel? And there's no pin there. In fact, there's no pin anywhere in that area. If you'll notice, it's like, okay, Europe, the Slavic nations, the United States, Central, South America, Australia, Asia, even into Russia, but there's no pin at the center of the universe, which is Jerusalem. There's nothing, there's no priority at all. And so much of Scripture depends upon there being an Israel on that map. And so much of what happens to you in your life depends upon your focus, sticking a pin in that place, whether you can go there or not. But your focus and your daily inquiry is related to that specific, not just spiritual land, but to that natural land. And this is a great graphic. I don't know why it popped up with that particular word, but I'm like, I'm gonna download this one. And if you ever need free graphics, go to unsplash.com, by the way. That's just a tip. They don't have a huge selection, but you never know what you'll stumble into for free, and free is always good. So here's our priorities. And this was among the fast facts. Approximately 2/3 of the Torah, as well as 2/3 of the Jerusalem Talmud, depend upon Eretz Yisrael. It has to be there in order for those things to matter at all. Now, some things are independent of the land. There's certain commandments that are independent of the land. There doesn't necessarily have to be a land in order for you to not steal something. You can be anywhere in the world. But if 2/3 of the Torah that we're studying every week depends upon there being a land, then that tells you your relationship to the land is also important, no matter where you are. And we can see that as Moses has to recount Israel's history to them, it's all swinging around this one problem. They didn't know when to go in. They didn't discern when the door was open. They didn't know how to check the balance sheet. They weighed themselves too heavy, and they weighed the Holy One too light in terms of their ability to go into the land. And that's typically where we get into trouble, just like with this priority map. How many of those pins do you think are going to come out on the balance sheet in terms of my personal ability, enjoyment, pleasure, contentment, Instagram? And how many pins do you see on the side of the balance sheet that would say, you know what, I care about the things that God cares about. What the Father wants for me, I also want for myself. Where's the pin that represents that side of the balance sheet? And you know, I got a lot of pins in my map, but I'm pretty sure they're going to balance out in terms of physical trips to Israel. Now, it's my job to make sure when I do go into the land that I don't go in casually, that I do my best to walk worthy, not just of the one who was able to take me there and give me the means to get there, but of all the people I represent when I go there who would be there if they could be there. They have a faith pin stuck in that map. They don't yet have, the door is not yet open for them. Israel had to wait till the door was open. And so for those people, the door is not yet open. So when he enables me to go, it's on their behalf. It's representing not just my faith, it's representing their faith as well. I'm saying, you know what? There's probably thousands behind me. Maybe some people I don't even know. And when I post something about Israel on Facebook or in the newsletter or pictures, they're looking at it with longing in their hearts. And they're saying, when is my door going to open? And until that time, I want to walk worthy of that open door that I have, because someday it may be closed. Or someday, just the fact that I keep knocking on that door may just spring wide open for all those people who would go to go. So you do what you can with what you have. Abraham had a lot, and he paid a lot for the cave of Machpelah. He paid for something that was already his. And that was our point last night. Come to Cheshbon, which means look at your balance sheet, which is what Moses is asking the children of Israel to do as they're poised here on the verge of going into the land. And once again, they're facing the Amori, which is the Amorite, the speaker. And if there's anything that will keep you out of the land, whether it is natural Israel or whether it is that spiritual Israel, that lower garden, that spiritual place of resurrection, if there's anything that'll keep you out of it, it's words. And so I don't think it's any coincidence that Devarim, Deuteronomy, means words. And the book opens up with the enemy called the Amori, the speakers, the sayers, the talkers, the big talkers. And in my experience, the bigger the mouth, the smaller the person. The less they actually have to say. The more they do say, the less they actually do have to say. It's the people who speak very little. Those are the ones you want to talk. You want to try to pull words out of them because typically they're very judicious with their words. And when something does come out, you know they have something to say that's of importance. But in the Mori, they can attack you with words, not just the words they say to you, but the words they can cause you to speak to yourself. And I'm affected by that because often you find yourself saying things about yourself, trying to degrade yourself or lower yourself, or I can't do that, I'm not good at that. And maybe you aren't as good as another person. But when we're constantly doing that, we're not necessarily seeing ourselves the way the Father sees us, and it's not really humility. Now, you don't need to run around saying how wonderful you are, right? Your actions can speak that way. But again, the words you speak to yourself, that self-talk can destroy your faith as fast as anything. And I experience this daily. I have to fight against those internal words that say it's impossible, it's a monster, it's too big, it's too chaotic, I don't know how it's going to happen. But that's the Amorite talking. And we have to go back and listen to Moses. We have to check the balance sheet and say, hey, wait a minute, these are just natural words based on my ability. Am I saying that there's no chaos so big that Adonai can't speak a creation of perfect order? I must be crazy. If I read the Bible every day and I still don't think he can bring order out of chaos and take his people back to the land because they're too rebellious and stiff-necked, and who am I? Then I'm just another Israelite that'll die in the wilderness. But if I change my words, if I change the way I talk to myself, which means I'm going to change the way I talk to other people, and I don't have to worry about the Amorite. In fact, I can live side by side with the Amorite like Abraham did, and it's not going to affect me. I'm going to maintain my own faith apart from anything an Amorite might say. In fact, I might influence the Amorite to start speaking differently. Part of it is we looked at Og, the giant, last night, and you can work through that later, because where I want to come to, again, it's joining together the idea that now that Israel is on the other side of the Jordan, dealing with the giants, the last of the giants, Og, in the land of the Rephaim, whereas their forefather Abraham lived side by side with giants, Amorites, and Hittites, and Hebron. So everything keeps going back to Hebron. There was giants here, there was giants there, there was Anakim at Hebron, there's Rephaim, where they're about to go in on the other side of the Jordan. So it's not as if probably it was the first time they'd ever heard of a giant. Abraham got along with giants. Like I said, we were talking last night. That must have been the weirdest neighborhood ever, because you've got Mamre, Aner, and Eshcol. You've got the Amorites. You've got the Hittites that he bought the cave of Machpelah. And then you've got the Anakim, which are the giants. That's just the weirdest neighborhood ever. And Abraham's like, no big deal. It's all good. Let's see, we went through the history there of Hebron and the different names that can signal you back to Hebron. Okay. And that was, I think, where we ended up. Why did Abraham pay so much money for land that was already his? He had to check his balance sheet. There's spiritual things and there's physical things. There's prophecy things that are not yet fulfilled, but there's things I do today because I believe the prophecy. And so even though Abraham had already been given the length and the breadth of the land, he still chose, and it was a test, to pay a lot of money for a little piece of physical land that was already his. And that's the lesson. That's the test. Would he pay for something that was already his? And that's one of the things that I hear a lot. If I'm around church people, I always encourage them to find a tour and go to Israel. I don't necessarily encourage them to go on mine. Might be a completely different focus than what they can swallow in 2 bites. But they should go anyway, because sometimes just going to Israel can spark something. And they might want to follow up on it. It at least opens that door to a greater relationship with the land itself. And so in this test, would Abraham pay the big price? And he did. And here's the quote that I was kind of basing this off of last night. And this is Rabbi Lichtman. He said, God wanted to teach Abraham and his descendants that Eretz Yisrael is acquired only through suffering. Before acquiring a plot for the living, one must first acquire a burial plot. In order to truly be able to strike roots and settle down in Eretz Yisrael, one has to first sacrifice for the land. And he points out it's not easy to live in God's chosen land. All through Scripture, it says how much he loves, the land, how much he loves Jerusalem, how his eyes are constantly on it, how he's inquiring about the land. And you're saying, well, if he loves it so much, why is it such a difficult place to put down roots? And, his comment, it goes back to this: before you can acquire a plot for the living, you have to acquire a burial plot. And then he points out that immediately after Abraham buries Sarah at Hebron, the Torah states, the Lord blessed Abraham with everything. So there's a part of you, see, Sarah is part of Abraham. And so he has to bury her. He has to make provision for his dead first before he can truly acquire that place for the living. His descendants, who like him, are also going to believe in a resurrection that is symbolized by that place at Hebron. Probably why you've got so many crazy people living in the neighborhood, like the Amorites, the Hittites, and the giants. And so by making provision for burial, burying a part of himself, he's demonstrating his faith that, this cave, it might look like a piece of rock on a hill, but I believe that it's the entrance back to the garden for us, that it's evidence of our faith in the resurrection. And you know what? I would get all of my silver. I would count all my silver as nothing to acquire this open door. Because when the time comes, That's what we want. We want to be right back into the garden. And this place symbolizes that entryway. And when he makes that decision, when he pays that great price, it says, then he gets everything. What he just paid out was nothing. And that's what I was telling him last night. No matter what you have paid, no matter what price you have paid for this walk in the Word with Yeshua, a day will come when you will count every sacrifice as nothing. Every misunderstanding with your family over Shabbat, every party you couldn't go to, every time you felt horrible telling your children, no, they couldn't do that particular thing. They couldn't watch that. They couldn't listen to that. They couldn't be with that person. They couldn't eat that. And feeling horrible, feeling like Og the monster. You're going to count it as nothing, even though right now it hurts deeply. The job that you gave up because it would be on Shabbat, the overtime you gave up because it would be on Shabbat, right now it hurts because you feel like your bank account reflects it. But a time will come when the true balance sheet will open up and you'll say, oh, dear Father, what I gave you was nothing. Compared, you've just given me everything for this little pittance, this little bit of inconvenience that I gave you. So let's look at Matthew 8:18. It says, when Yeshua saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to depart to the other side of the sea. And the sea, frequently in Scripture, represents the nations. He says, then a scribe came and said to him, remember, a scribe is someone who copies the Torah, so they know the Torah front and back, literally. Because if you've ever watched a scribe, they go backward. Why do they do that? It has to do with the smudging process with the ink. So they have to know the Torah forward and backward. That would probably make a good joke. The scribe comes and says to him, teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. Well, where is he going? He's going to the other side of the sea. Now, in a literal sense, he's going to the other side of the Galilee. In a prophetic sense, he's going to the other side of the earth. And the scribe said, I'll go wherever you go. Yeshua said to him, the foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Another of the disciples said to him, Lord, permit me first to go and bury my father. And I don't really like the way the English is worded, but let's just read it that way. But Jesus said to him, follow me and allow the dead to bury their own dead. That's implying a choice there. I don't think it's a choice. Once we look back here at the example of Abraham and what Moses is saying to the Israelites, again, tying them to Heshbon and the giants and their forefathers. When he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. And behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being covered with waves. But Yeshua himself was asleep. Now, when you see asleep, that should be a trigger for you by now. It's symbolizing death. All right, he's going to appear to be absent because of death. And they came to him and woke him, saying, save us, Lord, we're perishing, we're dying, save us. Basically calling him salvation, his very name. And he said to them, why are you afraid, you men of little faith? Why does death scare you? In other words, hear that consistency in the message. Why are you afraid of dying? He said to them, your little faith. You got a little. But then he got up and he rebuked the winds and the sea, and it became perfectly calm. The men were amazed and said, what kind of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him? All right, where it says he rebuked the winds and the sea, there's Jewish tradition associated with this particular Torah portion. And it's that if you have a strong rebuke to leave with somebody, unless they're caught up like actually in the sin, you do need to go ahead and call it out if they're doing it or they're about to do it. You need to say something. But if you just know they have a habit of it or they've done it in the past, even though they're not doing it at the present time, and you would really like to warn them, that you wait till just before you die, because if you're going to rebuke someone, the words have a greater impact. If it's like Jacob doing his deathbed blessings, and it turns out they're pretty much rebukes of his children. He saved the strong rebukes for the deathbed. Moses saved the strong rebukes basically for the deathbed. And so Yeshua gets up and rebukes the winds and the sea. And so it says it became perfectly calm, and they're amazed. They say even the winds and the sea obey him. But let's go back to this disciple here who said, Lord, permit me first to go and bury my father. But Yeshua said to him, follow me and allow the dead to bury their own dead. Now, even in English, follow that carefully. He says, follow me and allow the dead to bury their own dead. When we don't see that as a conjunction where he's giving the disciple a choice, you're either going to follow me or you're going to go bury your father. Well, in Jewish tradition, that would be unheard of. It could also be referring to that annual, like the father's been dead for a year. They've waited for the flesh to rot away. Then they're going to go take the bones and bury them in the bone box. So it doesn't really say which of those conditions. I lean toward the 1 year, simply because if he was in a house of mourning, he probably wouldn't have had occasion to run into Yeshua. So it's probably time for him to go collect those bones on behalf of the family and to put them in the family bone box. Whichever it is, it doesn't really matter. They're both acts of burying the dead. So Yeshua says, follow me and allow the dead to bury their own dead. Right? Now, if we put that back in the context of Abraham, he buried his own dead. He made provision for his own dead. And he paid a dear price to bury his own dead. And now we can kind of see an equivalency in the expression. Yeshua, like the scribe, he's telling this disciple, he's saying, you know what, if you follow me, you're going to pay a dear price. It wasn't cheap to die. It's just like today. I mean, back in 2003, it cost me $6,000 to bury my mom, and she already had the burial plot. And today it's more expensive. Unless you're doing something simple, it's very expensive to bury your dead. And so Yeshua is saying, if you follow me, you're going to pay a dear price. Just the way if you bury your dead. But remember, once Abraham paid that price for his dead, it says that Adonai gave him everything. So there is a part of us, if we're going to follow Yeshua, we're going to pay a dear price. And he says, okay, you're going to pay that high price if you choose to follow me across the sea. And he says, I'm allowing you to bury your own dead. And who is your own dead? It's who you are. It's a part of you that's going to have to die for the sake of the kingdom. Otherwise, you're not going to measure out that silver money. You're not going to pass up that better job. You're not going to pass up that overtime. You're not going to pass up allowing the kids to dictate how Shabbat goes, or the grandkids to dictate how Shabbat goes. Instead of you revolving around their secular activities on Shabbat, you will find a way to honor Shabbat, for they will not misunderstand and think that day really does revolve around them. Instead, they'll understand that no matter what they do, where they go, their lives are part of Shabbat, and they will have to bury their own dead. That's just the way it is. And it's hard when you're living in the exile. But see, that was the whole thing. Yeshua was going across the sea. It's going to be really hard where he's going in the nations, because in the nations, nothing is set up to be easy when you're following the Torah. And that's why in the Jewish tradition, they say this portion was actually explicated in the 70 languages of the earth, just to prepare the Israelites for where they would be exiled, so that they could find some way of communicating the instructions to the nations to where they could live in relative peace. But no matter how much peace you achieve with your neighbors and your family and your friends, you were still going to have to bury some dead in order to follow Yeshua and to keep his commandments. Because he gave you an open door. He gave you the understanding to be able to understand the covenant in a way that has not been understood, at least by Gentiles, for around 2,000 years. So in 2,000 years, if the door opens for you to really get the feast, to really get Shabbat, to really get kosher eating, and there's really not that many things, if you've come out of a church tradition, there's not that many more things that you're going to be doing to walk in the covenant. It typically, the biggest changes are in your holidays, in your Sabbath, and in your eating habits. Christians will still agree with you that tithing is a good idea, not committing incest is a good idea, not stealing is a good idea. It's going to be details other than those three. Those will typically be the big ones. But he said there's a price to pay. He says, I have no place to lay my head. And unless you're living in Israel, if you're living in the nations and you're trying to follow Torah, you really have no place to lay your head, especially if you're in our condition. Because see, if you were Jewish, you could go into a synagogue and lay your head. If you were purely Christian, you could go into the church of your choice and lay your head and be perfectly comfortable. But he opened a different door for you. And if you choose to go through that door, then you're not going to have a place to lay your head for a long, long time. Until you go up, until you're gathered. But he says, you've got to be willing to bury your dead. It's follow him and bury your dead. They're going to happen at the same time, because constantly as you follow him, you will be burying your dead and paying a dear price. Because at that point in your life, that thing you give up, that thing you do will cost you a lot. And there will be times you're not even sure you're doing the right thing, because it's so not a fit with everyone around you. It's so awkward. But that's what the rabbi says. Before you can acquire a plot for the living, you have to acquire a burial plot. If you want that door to Israel, natural or spiritual, to open for you, then you're going to have to bury some things. Before you put down roots, he's going to want to know, did you share in the fellowship of my suffering? Because if you didn't share in the fellowship of my suffering, what reward can I give you? What did it cost you to be with me? He says, I gave my own life. That's a lot of silver in order to redeem you, so that you also could, as we say in Christianity, take up your cross every day. Bury a little bit of yourself every day. Each time we do that, it's a test concerning resurrection life. And the more of the dead things we bury, the more he can give us. Even though at the time, it may not seem like much. Because even though it says he gave Abraham everything, at that point, you notice he starts to descend in importance in the stories. All of a sudden, Isaac ascends, the next generation. So sometimes what you see or what you experience in the natural realm, it's really difficult to see how it has opened doors in the spiritual realms. Let's see, did I miss anything on the scribe? Let's see. Okay. The idea of Yeshua going across the sea, which would have been, like I say, the other side of a big lake in reality, but figuratively, he's going out to the nations. And being Jewish, this scribe would have understood a principle, the law of return for Israel and all souls. We've talked about this in class before, that Yeshua, the Messiah, will not come until all the souls are completed or joined into the body, connected into the body that will be connected. And then once his body is completely put together, the Father then will allow him, the Messiah, to come. And so what is he doing? This is kind of wound into the law of return for Israel, because the understanding about all these souls in Jewish tradition is because they're all scattered out in the nations, and therefore they have to be gathered in order to come back into the land. They're not individual entities. They're all part of one thing. And so with this return, first you have to go scatter, right? And the scribe says, I'll go too. I'll take the message out there. I'll go look for those souls so that they can be put together into the body. But he's warned that you're going to lose your home in Israel if you do this. And here's the irony of this law about leaving Israel. There's a rabbinic law that says once you've been restored to the land and you make your home there, it's only permissible, and this is only one opinion, but everybody knows about it. It says it's only permissible for a Jew to depart from the land to search for a bride. And they use Eliezer as the example. And so there's an irony there that Yeshua is saying, you know what, I'm going to the other side of the sea. I'm going to the nations. And then the scribe saying, I'll go with you. I'll go to the nations too. What are they looking for? They're looking for a bride. They're trying to complete that return for Israel of all souls that make up truly the one great body of Messiah. Let's see, we talked about sleep being a symbol of death. And then it actually gives an example. When they're asking for salvation, he awakes. And we see that in Revelation, that the whole point of the tribulation is Adonai wants people to call out to him, to ask for salvation, to repent. And of course, in Revelation, they're not wanting to do that. But by going out into the nations, he wants them to ask for salvation. Because he did awake, he did resurrect, and therefore he wants to resurrect us. And so even the wind, the spirit, the ruach, and the sea, the nations obeyed him. So he's resurrected once before, but the second time we see him, he's going to be part of a greater resurrection that's going to include all the souls who have obeyed him through the power of the Holy Spirit. And by the way, I just finished putting this into the resurrection book this morning, that a quotation from the rabbis that talks about this leads to this, this leads to this. But at the end of the list, it says that the Holy Spirit leads to resurrection. So this is very much Jewish thought. it's highly mystical Jewish thought, by the way. We just thought it was like Yeshua on a boat and there was a bad storm and everybody got scared. And then he had to talk to the storm and then it's all cool. And it just shows us how great Yeshua is and how dumb the disciples were. That's okay when you're 6, but not when you're 60. You need to start looking at the more mystical, deeper levels of the symbols. And understand when you're seeing these symbols that we've learned in the Torah, when they start to pop up again in the Gospels. The Gospels are deep, by the way. I know we grew up on them as kids, but the more you learn of the Torah, the more you realize you're reading deep material when you read the Gospels. So that's pairing that natural balance sheet of Cheshbon, of how Israel can return. First, they have to come to the Cheshbon. They have to have an accounting. They have to check the balance sheet. And what they're going to realize is they're way in debt. Not just on the natural side of things, but you know what? They don't have a great balance on the spiritual side of things either. So they have to cry out to Adonai if they're afraid of the wind, which is the spirit. If they're afraid of the sea, of the nations surrounding them. If they're afraid of the giants, if they're afraid of the Amorites, if they're afraid of the words. And that's what's so troubling to me is, you know, you can see Yeshua sorting through people to find true disciples. And I don't know that that's our job. Because there are people who will come alongside you for a season of life and then they move on. And you've both accomplished your purpose. But there's a lot of people out here who are much more concerned with conspiracy theories and, you know, ancillary topics, but they don't have the patience to sit and study a Torah portion for an hour. They don't have the patience to study it for 30 minutes. I can measure how many people will read my Torah studies by their length. If it's a paragraph, there might be 3,000 people want to read it. If it's 4 or 5 pages, yeah, we don't have the patience for that. But we do have the patience to follow all these rabbit trails that are ancillary to the Torah. We know more about politics. We know more about good health. We know more about world news. We know, I mean, I can't tell you how much conspiracy stuff I get in my mailbox. And I'm thinking, what if they took all this time and really studied the Torah and learned about Yeshua and prepared themselves for an open door? Because I'm not sure if we're so busy following things out here on the periphery, we would even notice if he opened the door to Israel. And if he did, maybe we wouldn't want to go. Maybe we wouldn't. Who knows? Where you spend your time is telling me where you're paying your silver money. And you might miss it. You might miss the open door. Because let me tell you, these people were following Moses and missed it. These people had the Ark of the Covenant. They had the cloud. They had the miracles. They had the supernatural water. They had the manna. They had the tabernacle. They had fire on the mountain. They had a voice they could see. And they still didn't notice the door was open because they were too busy worrying about themselves, their own abilities, and how fragile and how small they felt against everything coming at them. And that's what I sense in a lot of this pursuit of conspiracy theory. It's like people become addicted to their own smallness. It's this huge government conspiracy. Well, yeah, it could be. What are you going to do about it? But I can do something about this Torah. I can study it so that I know when there's an open door of escape. No matter what kind of conspiracies are out there, no matter what kind of natural disasters are out there, no matter what kind of heretics are out there, as long as I keep setting that which is true and authentic, hopefully I will notice an open door and say, I'm sorry, Yeshua, you're just not strong enough to hold that door for me with all these giants, with all the wind, with all the waves, with all the Amorites, with all the talking. You know what? He can. I'm the one who can't without him. And that's what the Israelites didn't get. They said, oh, we can't do it. Well, they never could. It was the Ark of the Covenant that went before them. It was the cloud that covered them and protected them. And when they shifted from the report that should have reminded them that, no, you can't do it on your own. See, the worse the news is, the more comfortable you should feel that it's going to be a supernatural door that opens and he will supernaturally fight for you. And there's no amount of prepping you can do other than to immerse yourself in his word and to be sensible when it comes to natural things. So if we say we can't do it or I can't do it, the balance sheet is just out of whack. If we say we can't go to Israel, we're out of whack. And I've done this one. I've said Hebrew roots people are crazy. You know what? I was out of whack. When we say people can't do anything except exist in their natural state, in the natural realm, we're out of whack because we're only looking at the balance sheet on the natural side of things. But with the spirit of Adonai, see, I have to consider all the places he has taken me and all the miracles he's done in my life to bring me to this place. And when I consider the miracle that is me today, how can I possibly look around and say, you know what, this is as much as he can do. He's done. But that's what happens when we say, I can't do it. It's not possible. People are too crazy. The politics are just too messed up. The wrong people control the land. There's going to be missiles and bombs and everything in Israel. Well, yeah, all that's true. But with the spirit of Adonai, we have a protective cloud. We have water. We have manna. We have Moses. And all of that was embodied in Yeshua. He is that door. And if we remember that, we can balance the sheet. Because remember, our pitiful little sacrifices, once we give them up, these things that we think are so valuable, they're going to be elevated to a level of spiritual gold. It's faith currency. So what are you doing? Every time you give up something for the kingdom, you are spending a little gold or a little silver for a burial place for your death. You have to make a place for the dead. You have to bury the dead. But you can only bury your own dead. Did you catch that in what Yeshua told the guy who said, I need to go bury my father? He says, let the dead bury their own dead. You cannot. No way. See what I mean? You can't bury someone else's dead. You have to bury your own dead. There's obstacles in your life that probably you're putting up with them. You know there's a better way. There's a more faith-filled way, or there's a more faithful way than the way that you're doing things. But you're just kind of riding along because it's, you know what, this whole thing will blow up if I cause a problem here. But a time will come if you're praying. You say, you know, I want to break through in this situation. It's not just going to break through. you're going to spend a little silver and gold of your own burial for that breakthrough. You have to make a burial place for your own death. Maybe it's the death of expectation. Maybe it's saying, you know what, I've tried on my own long enough. I'm not doing anything except failing. Maybe what I give up is the death of my intervention. Maybe I just stand back and say, you know what, not by might, not by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord. From now on, I'm spending my gold and my silver in prayer until this situation opens up for me. Maybe it's being meek and humble enough to go to someone you trust who is a prayer warrior and saying, look, I have this obstacle in my life. I've been concealing it. I've been embarrassed by it. But could you pray with me? Make sure it's a righteous person, not somebody that just wants to hear you gossip, but somebody who cares about you, who will agree with you in prayer as you're spending that gold and silver of yourself to bury yourself so that some life can come out of the situation. Don't be embarrassed. We all have situations that, you know what, we've tried and we tried and we tried, and there's no breakthrough. It might be your children. It might be personal habits. It might be a relationship with your parents. It's okay. There's a whole body of Messiah that's willing to stand with you under the cloud. And you're part of them. And if you're hurting, they know you're hurting. They may not know why. You say, well, God will just place it on their hearts that they're supposed to pray for me. No, humble your proud self and ask for it. Die. None of us is too holy and too righteous and too Moses that we can't ask somebody to pray with us or pray on our behalf. And you know what? Ask for more. Don't just say, pray with me. Say, you know, if you've got a prayer list and you pray every day, could you keep me on there until I tell you to take me off? It's okay. All the souls are knit together. He's putting us together. And see, these 12 spies that went out, they shouldn't have been anything more than an advanced team of reporters. But they're just like reporters we have today. They do way more than report what happened and what they saw. They try to interpret it for us and create policy to direct the emotions of the masses. So what did they do? They did report, and they gave a true report that what they said was there was absolutely there. It was the way they packaged and placed those words that turned the report into much more than a report. Because if you'll remember, up to this point, it's the cloud or the Ark of the Covenant who's going to be leading them around, not their own warriors. And I think that's why Moses is spending a lot of time in this portion explaining what happened in Bamidbar. He's trying to remind them, and there's a word that's used repeatedly as it applies to those spies. You'll find the word in Numbers 13:2, 15:39, and 10:33 through 34. So let's look at it. In Numbers 13:2, he says, send out for yourself men so that they may spy. Yaturu. And that root word there is tur. I don't know, it's very much, you can remember it if you can just remember the English go on a tour. But so they may spy out the land of Canaan, which I'm going to give to the sons of Israel. You shall send a man from each of their fathers' tribes, every one a leader among them. And this word means to meander around, to seek, to search out, to spy out, to explore. And I think explore is really a good English word to describe what they should have been doing, to bring back this report. But what they did is they brought back their visuals and they added a military assessment. And that made the balance sheet off. They thought that somehow their ability was on the balance sheet. When our ability is not on the balance sheet, our participation is on the balance sheet. And participation means I am following, not out in front trying to make it happen. I am following where the Spirit goes. I'm following the ark. I'm under the cloud. And they put themselves in front of the ark, and they took themselves out from under the cloud and said, we can't do it. That's not what Moses needed from them. He needed a report, not an opinion. Of course, it's hard to get a report without an opinion these days. But they accomplished the physical job, which was conducting an exploration. But because they were each leaders, I think they misunderstood their roles. And maybe Moses didn't make it clear. Maybe he didn't remind them that even though you're leaders, your role is to follow the word. Another place where this word is used is Numbers 10:33. It says, they set out from the mount of the Lord 3 days' journey with the ark of the covenant of the Lord journeying in front of them for 3 days to seek out, latur, that's the same Hebrew word, a resting place on them. So it's exploring out, it's seeking out. The cloud of the Lord was over them by day when they set out from the camp. Then it came about when the ark set out that Moses said, rise up, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered, and let those who hate you flee before you. Right there is the simple prescription. When the door is open, the ark is going to know it. And when the ark starts moving, the cloud of protection will also move with them. And all they have to do is walk through the door. And you notice it says, let your enemies be scattered. They don't have to pick up a sword. They just walk through the door. Why? Because the Spirit of Adonai is going to chase those enemies. They're going to think they're being chased when no one's chasing them. It says, let those who hate you flee before you. You don't have to lift a finger. And here are the Israelites whining about, we can't do it. What were they saying? Our swords aren't sharp enough. There's not enough of us. Og is too ugly. No, he's already showed them that they can defeat Og, the ogre. Jewish tradition says he was like super ugly. Kind of like a Shrek looking guy. But it doesn't matter how ugly they are. It doesn't matter how gigantic they are. Even if they're like Og sitting on a city wall like it's a fence. It doesn't matter if you don't even have to touch him for him to be scattered and to flee. So it wasn't the warriors of Israel who did the exploring for a place to rest. It was the ark and the cloud. They were to follow, not to lead. And it says, rise up. There's the resurrection language that applies to the land of Israel. And that's what leaders do. They lead by following the word. And then the third place this is used in Numbers is Numbers 15:39, and it applies to the tzitzit. They've already had this failing, and then they had another failing. And so they're given the commandment of tzitzit. It says, it shall be a tassel for you to look at and remember all the commandments of the Lord, so as to do them and not to follow after, taturu, to explore after, to seek after your own heart and your own eyes, after which you played the harlot, so that you may remember to do all my commandments and be holy to your God. So the distraction was what their eyes and their hearts saw. And instead of actually doing the exploration for a simple report, they actually start exploring the plausibility of moving into Israel. And to this day, when you look at moving into Israel from a strictly rational, natural viewpoint, it seems impossible or unlikely, especially if you're not Jewish. It's unprofitable. It's nothing but trouble. I mean, it's fun when you're on a tour because everything has been prepared before you. Not the Ark of the Covenant, but a few people have been doing things before you. so that it's convenient, it's tasty, it's Wi-Fi. But for the normal average person thinking, you know what, I want to put my foot here and do more than just stay at a nice hotel. Maybe I want to volunteer. Maybe I want to work here temporarily. Whatever I'm able to do, it's going to be inconvenient and it's going to be unsafe. There's no place you can go in Israel where there's not going to be the possibility of violence. You're not going to get free bread, water, and shade every day. You're not going to get free clothes and shoes. And truly, you can't tell it by looking at certain groups of people, but it is more than sitting on your tea kettle learning Torah all day. It's work. It'll cost you something to be in that land. It's a hard place to be on purpose. Because remember, the reward is commensurate to the suffering. You have to purchase the plot for the dead in order to make way for life. And in Abraham's day, the giants left him alone. In Moses' day, they took up arms. You have to be prepared for peace. You have to be prepared for war. And so if we look at Deuteronomy 11, we have some comments about these spies that Moses is really concerned with in this Torah portion, because he really regrets this time in the wilderness. But he also knew if they tried to go into the land in that state of rebellion, it would have spit them right back out. It would have killed them. So it was an act of mercy for them to go back into the wilderness and let that generation die out. But it almost sounds like the Holy One agrees with the people concerning the land, that it is inferior to Egypt. In Numbers 11:8, or I thought it was Deuteronomy. Might ought to check that. I might have that wrong. He says, "You shall therefore keep every commandment which I am commanding you today, so that you may be strong and go in and possess the land into which you are about to cross to possess it, so that you may prolong your days on the land which the Lord swore to your fathers to give to them and to their descendants, a land flowing with milk and honey. For the land into which you are entering to possess it is not like the land of Egypt from which you came, where you used to sow your seed and water it with your foot like a vegetable garden. But the land into which you are about to cross to possess it, a land of hills and valleys, drinks water from the rain of heaven, a land for which the Lord your God cares." That Hebrew word is tharash. He investigates. "The eyes of the Lord your God are always on it, from the beginning even until the end of the year." Now that's pretty incredible. He's setting apart, and if Egypt is such a great place, then imagine Israel compared to any other place in the world. He says it is distinct. And he says, you know what? It's easier outside of the land. It's easier on the other side of the sea than it is to live in Israel. Because once you move outside the land of Israel, then you're really falling strictly into a natural realm. Remember, the laws that apply to the land frequently do not apply outside the land. It has to be treated in a very special way. But once you cross into the land, it's going to require something different from you than it requires of you in those nations out there. You're going to get away with a lot in those nations out there that he's not going to let you get away with in the land itself. How does he care for Israel? Well, it says he darash. It says he treads or he frequents Israel. He asks after it. He inquires after it. He questions it. He requires things. So when you think of being in Israel, what you have to realize, it's, when we were kids, when somebody would do something they knew they weren't supposed to do, we'd say, God's watching. And in this case, he really is. Now, he can see everything, but as it concerns Israel, it says he is diligent. He is walking through it constantly, searching, inquiring, questioning, moving. That's where he hangs out. That's where his presence wants to be. And that's how it's different from Egypt and every other place. And see, the thing about Egypt is it's easy to get food because it's predictable. They know when the river is going to flood. They irrigate with the water. And you can make a living in Egypt. His example here is because those crops are not dependent upon their inhabitants being obedient. You can have a very distant relationship to Adonai. You can be carried away with the cares of the world, and you can, in the physical realm, you can even prosper because it's not as spiritual a location on the balance sheet. So if you're willing to live more heavily on that side of the balance sheet, to rely on the laws of nature, then you're happier in Egypt. But when you go into Israel, it does depend upon the obedience of its inhabitants to those commandments. It says it's a land of hills and valleys. It makes it nearly impossible to control the water supply, like you can in those flat deltas of Egypt. When the land is flat, it's easier to control it. But the hills and the valleys, you can try to control the waters of the Galilee, but that's just one source and stream of water. For the entire land of Israel, it's much more difficult. So you have to depend upon your relationship to Adonai. You have to let that ark go ahead of you. And you'll become closer to him. You'll obey him. You'll seek after him, especially in the Sabbath, especially at the feasts. Because the land, the feast, the people, the covenant, it's all one thing that you can't tear apart. And so if you're going to live in the land, you're going to have to live a lot closer to the Holy One if you want to eat. If you want to have things that balance out on the natural side of the balance sheet, it depends on what's going on the spiritual side of the balance sheet. I quoted Lichtman again here. It says, outside the land, everything depends on you. Study hard, go to the right school or college, get the right job, make the right friends, plan your budget. You'll succeed. You can actually forget who gave you the wisdom and understanding to succeed. But he says in Israel, this is much less likely to happen. You can plant the right seeds, but if God doesn't provide the rain, you're in trouble. He says in Israel, it's not uncommon to study 5 years for a profession and then find out, well, you can't make any money doing that anymore. It could happen anywhere in the world, but it's more common in Israel. Why? Because educational institutions, there's not as many of them. In the United States, we've got all kinds of specialized places you can go. But in Israel, they don't have the same choices. He says, what do then? You lift your eyes heavenward and you beg for mercy. And he says, thus, Eretz Yisrael is more conducive to developing a close relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is the Holy One. So, the explorers gave the right report until they added their judgment as to whether the Israelites were capable of actually doing it. Up until then, they were on track because Moses wanted them to see that it was too much for them in the natural realm. It would remind them that they were living a life of impossibility. He's like, check your balance sheet. Come to Heshbon here. Every day you are treated to the supernatural. Supernatural food, supernatural water, supernatural clothes, supernatural protection with the clouds, supernatural leadership with the ark. You get this every single day. And so when you say you can't do it, you're right. So as they're about ready to go back in and the door is open one more time, he says, let's go back and let's go over this so that you'll remember it's not by your own natural hand that you're going to do this. It's only by his supernatural intervention that this door is going to open. Don't take for granted all the miracles that brought you to this place. Come to Heshbon, check the balance sheet. How did you get here? How are you sustained every day? Before you start running your mouth about whether it's impossible or not. And that makes you an Amorite when you start running your mouth. Cheshbon is from cheshav, which means to think, to plan, to calculate, to make a judgment, account. If you ask for the cheshbon, bevakasha, if you're in Israel, it means I need my bill, please, so I can settle my bill. And so when it says come to cheshbon, and it's, remember, our Torah portion is read on the week of Tisha B'Av. And Tisha B'Av falls on Shabbat this year, so it's kicked off till the next day. But that's an accounting time because the month of Elul is coming up and the shofar is going to start blowing. It's going to confuse the adversary, is the tradition. But what we should worry about is when the shofar starts blowing, will we be confused? Will we have disrupted our own thinking and our own ability to calculate and count? And will we rely too heavily on our own skill and say, you know what, Adonai brought me here. He's the one who has guided my travels, my experiences, my miracles, my salvations, my redemptions. And when the door opens, he's the one that's going to make the way for me to go in. It's just my job to think about it and maintain my account book. So I just set up a little chart here, like to contrast your natural side and spiritual side. On the spiritual side, you have the Ark of the Covenant going before you. You have the word of Adonai. On the natural side, you actually have to do it. We will do, we will hear. On the spiritual side, the cloud is going to protect you. It's supernatural. But see, on the natural physical side, you have to work on your wisdom and understanding, which means you have to study the word and listen to the word and do the word. It goes back to obedience, but you're going to have to study it. Right? Don't sit around and say, the Holy Spirit's going to teach me all things. Well, it may not be the Holy Spirit teaching you something if you leave it that wide open. You have to get into the word. It's up to Adonai to open the doors, but it's up to us in the physical realm to act when he opens a door. Because we can see from the Torah portion, he's very likely to close it if we start acting silly and running our heads. On the supernatural side, we have to know, Bezrat Hashem, with the help of God, we do anything because he goes before us. On the natural side, what are we responsible to do? Maintain pure speech. Don't slander the land. Because when we're slandering the land, we're saying he's not able to fix it for us. And that's grave. I know we're out of time. Let's see, it's 1:48. Tell you what I'll do. I'll just scroll through these slides and you can follow up this week if you want to go farther. I think we almost did it. But it goes back to making a place for the dead so that you can make a place for life. And that's what's required of us. And that's the question I think Moses was asking the people. What are you waiting for? Are you waiting for something to happen in the natural realm? Or are you waiting for something to happen in the supernatural realm? When we understand that Adonai has to go before us, and we understand that the only way we're going to know he's gone before us is being acquainted with the word, with the commandments that are in that ark. And how in the world can you truly understand something unless you do it and apply it? And so that's the question. What are you waiting for? Are you waiting for something to happen in the natural realm? Are you waiting for something to happen in the supernatural realm? And the thing is, it's a balance sheet. He says, come to Cheshbon. Take account. You can't sit around and wait for Messiah to bring you back to the land if he's already opened the door for you to stick a foot in. Abraham had the money to pay. And Abraham managed that money in a way that when that door was open, he was able to pay. But see, if we're in pursuit of all these other things that drain our batteries, and then we say, well, it's too expensive to go to Israel. Well, you know, how many times a week do you eat out? If we went through your account books, if you handed me right now your checkbook and said, go through it, you probably don't have a checkbook anymore. Back in the good old days, we had ledgers. And a completely neutral party went through your ledger. What if, what do you call them? Financial advisor. What if a financial advisor went through your ledger and had you account for how you spent your money, or how you spent your time, or how you spent your words? Do you think it would be balanced? Do you think they would find a pin stuck over in Israel as one of those places I want to visit, more than I want to visit Hong Kong, more than I want to visit Melbourne, more than I want to visit Buckingham Palace, Disneyland, Yellowstone Park, the Redwoods, the Grand Canyon? Is Jerusalem my chief joy? And we have to say, what's in our way? Is it family? And we're not talking about just physically going and visiting the land of Israel. We're even talking about on your balance sheet where you've invested yourself spiritually in the land of Israel. Because the land of Israel cannot be separated from its people and its covenant. You have a natural family and you have a spiritual family. Is that in balance? What about comfortable accommodations? Remember what he told the scribe? He says, I don't have a place to lay my head. If you're going to follow me, it's not going to be comfortable. And we can see that going back into the land, it's not always comfortable. It's scary. There's things you can do that are scary, but they're worth it. Like a roller coaster ride. Okay, so Israel's like the best possible roller coaster ride in the world. It's scary, but it is worth every second. Every difficult thing that you have to do, not just to be there, but what you have to do to prepare yourself to be there, whether it's in the spiritual realm or if it's in the natural realm. Some people can't go in the natural realm, but in the spiritual realm, they can absolutely prepare themselves. And you know, one way you do it, straightening up your mouth so that you're not an Amorite, so that you're not one of the talkers. Says you can't do it. The mountain's too big. The giants are too big. Are we looking for something closer and more convenient? The scribe says, I will go with you. A scribe is someone who knows the Torah. If we claim to know the Torah, why aren't we saying, Yeshua, I will go with you even if we have no place to lay our heads? If a fox and a bird has a nicer place to stay at night, will we still go with you? Will we still follow your word, even when it feels like we got no home? I got no place to go. I got no church to go to. I got no synagogue that wants me. There's nobody in my area that thinks like me. Will you follow his word anyway? Because when you follow his word anyway, you are preparing for that open door when he does come to take you home. Are you waiting for the resurrection? For some people, that's the way it's going to be. For some people, if you're like Abraham and he gave you the silver, why not bury part of yourself? Why not bury Disneyland or Myrtle Beach or you fill in the blank, your favorite place? Why not bury that for a few years and start resurrecting the land? See, I did it once. And you know what's going to happen? You're going to do it once and you're going to get hooked. Because then you're going to realize why he loves that land so much and why so much of the Torah hangs upon there being a physical land. And you're going to join those hosts of people who have sacrificed, like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, in order to return for whatever amount of time they could. Caleb, he got a few days in the land and then he had 40 years of separation. But he came back. He came back again and it was his. And not just his, it says he gave the springs, upper and lower springs, to his daughter, to his offspring. And that's why sometimes you have to separate your family so that ultimately they will learn from your faith. They will learn from your burial plot where you're burying yourself. And someday they will have the faith to come to you like Caleb's daughter and say, give me an inheritance. Give me the upper springs and give me the lower springs. I want a balanced sheep that's balanced. I want the spiritual things that you can pass on to me. And I want the natural inheritance that you can pass on to me so that I can function the way that Adonai has called me to. Thank you for not letting me be the center of your orbit. Thank you for reminding me every day, in spite of the tantrums I threw, in spite of the crying I did, in spite of the anger and the sadness that you knew you would be the cause of. You still reminded me that the ark goes before us, that the burial precedes life. And so thank you for helping me find balance in my life between the physical, natural things that every child must do and the spiritual things of the word, and not letting me forget, in the end, what do you have if you don't have the spiritual side of the balance sheet? Because in the end, where are you going to send them? Where are they going to go? If you're the best cheerleader on the squad, at the resurrection, does that give you a higher place on the cloud? If you're the best basketball player on the team or the best football player on the team, does that give you a higher place on the cloud at the end of days? What can you give your child that ensures their presence within the cloud? You can give them your example. Just like the ark goes before you, you have to go before them. And when your life rotates around them, instead of you pulling them into the orbit of God's word, it's confusing. They'll lose their boundaries. And eventually they'll be angry because they'll look back and say, why didn't you correct me? You were the grown-up. Why didn't you let me hate you for a season when you knew it would be for my good ultimately? Don't wait to obey the word. Don't wait. If the door's open, take it, because when it closes, all you're really waiting on is to die. That's not a great place to be. I don't want to be sitting around saying, well, that door closed on me. I guess all I got to do now is die. Through Yeshua, we can say, you know what? I missed some doors. I missed a lot of doors. He opened a lot of doors for me. And I was too stupid to take them. Because I had my priorities wrong. My balance was wrong. But you know what, Yeshua? Help me. The next time you open a door, I want to go through it. I want to be close enough to you. And that's really what Israel is. It's living in a state of total dependence upon heaven. I want to be so totally dependent upon you that I can't miss that door anymore when it's open. Because there's no place else to go. You can't go back to Egypt. And that, I think that's what I put on the end of here. Where are we going to go? Now that we're out of Egypt, there's nothing else.